Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Will Marie Newton, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Should you have any questions, please type them in the question box and we'll answer them as we go along. If you have further questions after the webinar has ended, please feel free to email me and I will forward them to the appropriate person that can answer them. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared with all who registered for today's workshop and also archived on CABE's website under Professional Development. And now I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Sheila McKay, Senior Staff Associate for Government Relations.
Good morning, all. Thank you, or good afternoon, all. Thank you for joining us. Patrice McCarthy is here, who will play a leading role in conversations we have later on in the broadcast. I wanted to talk with all of you about the lobbying process, and that's why you joined on today. You have a role as your district's chief advocate for the students in your district to advocate for funding, for programs, for how well your implementation is going. I might mention your reading program right about now. You know, there are a number of things that the legislative process is involved in. There was an editorial today by Senator Billy Miller on the reading program that she was the chief sponsor of. And I can send that along to all of you if you haven't had a chance to read that. And in terms of its inception and so forth. I'm going to get started by just telling you how it works at the legislature. There is the way it works and there's the way that it runs, I guess maybe is another way of saying it as well. But so as I said, you are the advocate on behalf of your district at the state level. Many of the legislators, most of the legislators don't serve on the education committee, therefore they don't see the legislation that comes before the committee firsthand. They don't vote on it firsthand, not until it comes before them in the chamber, in the House or Senate chamber. So you would be the resource and along with your superintendents to let them know how this could potentially change how things are working in your districts. Certainly there's always an opportunity to tell them how well things are working as well. So there's that. So we're going to get started. So each of the legislative body itself, there are each Senate and House member serves a 2-year term. They were just reelected. There were a number of legislators that chose not to run. There were 1 or 2 that lost their election. There weren't many. And right now it's a jockeying for chairmanships and just assignments as a whole. We do see every 2 years a change in leadership, but change in, well, not always a change in leadership, but some changes in leadership, whether it be the executive branch or the chairs of the committees or the Speaker of the House. So this year we may see change in the leadership of the Education Committee's House Chair, Representative Sanchez. May not seek his chairmanship again. There are 36 senators, 151 representatives. I'm going to move down here. No, I'm not. Okay, let me do it this way. The size of the Senate district is about 4 times that of the House district. That's why you'll see more of a geographic area that the Senate would represent. Leadership of the Senate. The leadership of the Senate is known as the President Pro Tem. He's the majority leader in the Senate. He's voted on by the full Senate. Speaker of the House, majority leader in the House, voted on by the full House. Oops. Okay. Okay. Committees. The committees are. I'm just looking for the one key to get me up and down, and it doesn't seem to Want to move me?
Let's see. Is this?
That should be good by going in and out though. Yeah. Technical difficulties, all well. So committee structure. Connecticut is unique to every other state in the nation in terms of it having joint committees. I don't know how other states do it. We're blessed to the extent that there are joint committees. So members of the House and members of the Senate both serve on the Education Committee, both serve on the Appropriations Committee equally. Not equal in numbers. There aren't as many senators as there are members of the House on a committee just by virtue of numbers. A proposed, let's see, where were we? The largest committees are Appropriations, Finance, Revenue and Bonding is one committee. Appropriations, as I said, Finance, Revenue and Bonding is another committee. Labor, Public Health, and Education. Those are the bigger committees. There are other committees certainly that we're aware of, and I'm not aware of, that we work with in terms of education issues. The Children's Committee sometimes has a purview into education issues that we sometimes question, but they do. The Planning and Development Committee certainly does. And then Government Administration and Elections, just in terms of municipal issues and board issues. And then the Environment Committee certainly as well. Those, as I mentioned, but we certainly are looking, yes.
Just really quickly, I want to let everyone know that the handouts are available under the drop down where it says handout. That way they can pull it up, and because it's a little small on our screen, but that way they can follow along. Okay.
Yeah, it's right here with that big red mark.
Yes.
Yeah, and I can make it bigger. So those are some of the committees that we follow. Certainly we're looking at legislation in every one of the committees, and there are, I believe, 19 or 20 committees. I'm forgetting at the moment. Each committee has a co-chair, has co-chairs, as I mentioned earlier. We are expecting that Senator McCrory will continue on as the Senate chair, but again, nothing set in stone. We do expect by the Christmas holiday that these chairmanships will have been decided. Some of them have been decided at the House level for the Finance Committee and the Environment Committee and so forth, but not yet by Education. Legislation, proposed bills are first voted on in committee. It's usually pro forma before they have a public hearing, before one is scheduled. Education committees, I don't want to say they're unique, but they really do look at all the proposed bills and then they decide what bills they will then create on their own and have committee bills from those. So if Senator Smith, let's say, raises a bill, not necessarily, and it's number 123, Senate Bill 123 may not make it, even though proposal might be a good idea. They may just take his idea and create a new bill from there. It's not unheard of, and it's not a problem really. A proposed bill can be one sentence or 50 pages. Last year we saw that the social emotional learning bills at the legislature, the mental health bills, were being crafted starting like October and November, so that when session came around in February, the bills were well on their way. Certainly not completely, but they were, I think, 103 pages as they were initially proposed. So that was unique. Public hearings are opportunities for you all to offer testimony in support or in opposition to a bill. We can help you with that. We can let you know how best to draft, where to send it, how lengthy, how much you should include, how to target your legislation, who to give your legislation to besides just the clerk of the committee. If you can't be there in person, you can submit it, but there's no substitute for being there in person. The legislature, we expect, will be as open as it was last year in terms of public hearings last year were done remotely, as I recall. So actually that may be the change. The public hearings may be in person. At least we hope they will be.
Or perhaps a hybrid version.
A hybrid, yes, hybrid. That's a good point too. And as I mentioned there, you can poke holes in the testimony that's offered before you, or say we heartily agree with what you just heard, and we want to tell you why we agree. And again, you're laying groundwork for what will follow in terms of, maybe you're the first one of a group of people to speak, and you say, I know my colleague is testifying, and 4 people later than me on the list, and they're going to mention this. So it's a good way of priming the pump. This is an opportunity to answer any legislator's question on the spot, and that's invaluable. That question may be directly asked of you as you're testifying, or if you're there, they may say, out in the hallway, they may say, you just testified on X. What about this? So you'd be there to be able to help answer some of those questions, and that, again, is very, very helpful. There's no substitute for being there, and we can help you be a part of that process and navigate the process. I often say democracy is messy. You sign up for a public hearing. It's a lottery process. So you don't know when you go to pull a number, what number you'll get. And you don't know how many other people are asking to pull numbers. So the messy part is you could testify at 8 p.m. at night. It's not ideal, but that's part of the process. After the public hearing process, there are ways in which, you've mentioned how the legislation is moving forward, and they need to then schedule a committee meeting to vote on that piece of legislation. From your comments offered in public hearing testimony, they may make some changes. So a bill would be voted out of committee, and that's what they call joint favorable. Again, a nod back to the fact that they are joint committees in Connecticut by the House and the Senate. And what terminology is that they would have a JF meeting to vote bills out of committee. So we're looking at probably usually 3 public hearings, probably 5 committee meetings, maybe more. Those committee meetings would only be a notice of a day before. The public hearings have 5 days notice. Those 5 days include the weekends. But bills are available to peruse, and we can help you go through certain sections of the bill. If a bill is voted out with substitute language, so we've offered a change, you've offered a change, then that would be voted out with a JFS, joint favorable with substitute language. So that's how that works. So let me move this way, and then if I can move this up. That's not what I wanted to do. All right, bear with me here, folks. Let's see. Okay. Well, that's not necessarily highlighted for any particular reason. It's oh dear. I mentioned the JF progress, how things are JF and JFS. There are also, it's an ongoing issue in terms of a bill is not necessarily done after the committee votes on it, meaning that they mention the phrase, it's a work in progress, it's just a work in progress, get me your notes or get me some more information, or we need to sit down with the governor's office, or any number of reasons why it's a work in progress. Again, as I say there, it's a good or a bad thing. We want to sometimes see that our version goes forward, and at the moment that's our version and we like it. We don't want someone to influence the way that we now see that being written. Or we don't like it and we do want to influence the way it's been written. So so there are good and bad reasons for a work in progress. A JF or a JFS bill can go straight to the House or Senate, or it can go to another committee. And typically the motion would say JF to finance or JF to appropriations, JFS to appropriations. We want to make sure that the bills that are looking for funding go to the appropriations committee, because we want to make sure the funding is attached to those bills. Each of the 4 caucuses will screen any bill that comes before their chamber. So the House Republicans and the Senate Republicans and all the different groups will meet before, typically they meet Monday afternoons and go through the list of bills that are ready for the chamber. They're properly before the chamber. They need to be on the Senate or the House calendar for 3 days before they can be debated. And they are listed on the calendar. Any bill can be referred to a committee if it's, I use the example often of a school bus, bill on school buses. It may originate in the Transportation Committee, but it would make its way to the Education Committee. So a bill might be JF'd out of Transportation to the Education Committee. It wouldn't go to the House or Senate, it would go to the Education Committee. And then the Education Committee would likely JF it to, whether it's a House bill or Senate bill, to that body. But then there are also ways in which the caucuses are looking at bills and saying, you know, we made as many changes as we thought the public could handle last year on this proposal. We can't handle one more change. Let's send that bill back to committee. And maybe next year will be a year to make some of the changes that we think we need to make. So they have ways of killing a bill by sending it back to committee. Or it could just stay on the calendar with no action at all. Let's move down further. Oops. Okay. Yeah. The wheel. Okay. Yeah.
I don't know where you are.
Yeah, okay, thanks, that's okay. Okay, so session, being in session. When the House or Senate meet, they work off a calendar, as I mentioned. Any bill that's double starred can be considered for action. When the bill is screened by leadership, it gauges if it needs to potentially have an amendment, as I mentioned earlier, a work in progress. Amendments are filed sometimes the second before they're debated. Sometimes they're filed a week before they're debated. That's where, as lobbyists, we are in the building and made aware of amendments that are being filed, constantly looking to see if any changes have been made to the bill. Even though an amendment is filed doesn't mean it will be called. You know, they may offer an amendment or file an amendment, and somebody may, a lobbyist or a member of the Department of Education may call and say, oh, you got that wrong. You know, line 3 is supposed to be written this way. They say, oh, we'll file another amendment. So just because it's up there doesn't mean it's necessarily going to be called. But it does give you a sense that they are working on that piece of legislation. It might be moving more quickly than you realized, or that it's even moving. If amendment failed in committee, it could come back. So this is another opportunity, another bite at the apple, good or bad. If in the weeks since the committee voted on and another issue arises, the bill could be amended in any way. In the Senate, members of both sides would caucus, as I said, and again, review the screen bills before they're gavelled into session. Usually the Senate has lunch and then they caucus and they might go in at 3, they might go in at 5, they might break for dinner, they might come back. Things operate differently in the Senate. The House in the last, I'm gonna say 8 years, has made a practice of going in on time. And it's been lovely in that respect. That doesn't mean that they don't break for caucus if they need to. They could do 2 pieces of legislation and then break for caucus. The House does not typically hold caucuses every day. They will save caucuses for major pieces of legislation. And then they could very well go in before they even start debating. So there are different ways in which each chamber operates. The Senate operates on a consent calendar in sometimes one of the most efficient ways possible. You'd love to see if it's your bill moving forward, your bill, a bill that you support, moving forward and get consented right out of the Senate chamber. Or you may want to have seen an amendment added to it and they didn't do it. Then you go down to the House and ask them to do it, and it has to come back up to the Senate. But there are ways in which the Senate operating that quickly is beneficial. The House is very much it just takes a little bit longer with so many members. The House as I said, does not usually caucus before every time they go in. They have a smaller version of their calendar that they put out every day called the Go List. And even the Go List isn't something they're all those items that are on it are not necessarily bills they're going to be debating that day, but it's certainly smaller than if potentially the House calendar is 20 pages, they might come out with a 2-page calendar, and of those 2 pages, they may get to 9 pieces of legislation that day. Depends on how many amendments, it depends on how important those bills are, again, debate in the House just takes longer. Lobbying itself, in terms of what CABE does on your behalf, we have a State Relations Committee meeting. It's scheduled for Monday the 12th. If you're not aware of that, we would love to have you. The priorities of the association will be discussed that day. We typically go in with 3 or 4 key proposals, because we just wouldn't get much traction if we asked for too much more. Board of Education members and legislators and superintendents join us for breakfasts that we hold around the state of Connecticut. There are 9 different districts that CABE breaks the state up into. So we'll be setting those up in the next couple of weeks for January, usually January. That is an opportunity for you all to be in the same room with your legislators and talking about how things are working. And then they might say, oh, I'm going to offer a bill. I haven't had a chance to mention it to you, but my other district said it was important. How does your district feel about this? So again, important to be in the room. I will meet earlier in the timeline of the session with every member of the Education Committee, and we set up those meetings at the legislature. I imagine some will be done by Zoom again this year, as there are some members that come in from Stonington and from Greenwich and may not come in every day if they're not in, if they don't need to be at a committee meeting or in session. So I imagine that is something that will continue to be done. And if you all have good relationships with your members of the legislature, let us know, because we're going to use you to help us make some of the points. So that's always beneficial. It's a layered approach to lobbying. As the bill is scheduled for a public hearing, we all let you know that. Again, we get the 5 days notice. We will read the pieces of legislation and we will put out a summary for you to look at. And then we'll base testimony on what bills we think we need to offer testimony on. The more input that we have from you, the better we can advocate on your behalf. And you may not have a chance to testify, may not even want to offer testimony, but you may want to say, hey, but you ought to mention. Call us, let us know. We can be, you can only bolster what we do if you do that. As the bill moves forward to the Senate or the House chamber for debate, CABE is lobbying members to gauge their support or opposition to a piece of legislation. We've been helpful in killing bills. Or moving a bill forward. And then, we always hear too, some bills are languishing on the calendar, and that's worrisome if we don't want to see it go forward, but they may want to use that bill for other purposes. They can gut bills and just use the numbers. Legislators seek out CABE let me lose my point. As the bill moves forward, as we mentioned, we're lobbying members. Legislators seek out CABE to better understand a bill if in particular they don't serve on the Education Committee, and we assist them in maybe better understanding it, or saying, we know you're a member of we know your board chair, we know your superintendent, you ought to call them, they're really good on this issue. Or let me ask them to call you on this issue, so we can work both ways in that respect. We work very closely with the Superintendent's Association on making joint statements when we need to. So that runs through there. I don't know if any of you have questions. I should have mentioned you should feel free to offer them as you have them, but we can take questions now. We also wanted to run through a quick scenario with you that don't have.
You want mine?
Yeah, well, okay. Just in terms of the way in which you would lobby, certainly you can make a formal appointment. Certainly you can see them in the produce section, at the dry cleaners, wherever it is. They typically know they're going to be stopped in public. Many of them say that their spouses do the food shopping for those reasons. So we had put together just a scenario on ways in which you can advocate in the best way. So we're just going to do a little role play here. We have two different scenarios we'll do for you. So I'm going to treat Patrice as our resident representative. Patrice, we'll call her at the moment. So I am a board member, and I say to Patrice, you have to do something about special ed. It's killing us.
Well, I have a lot of priorities this legislative session, and so I need to understand how that's going to fit into the priorities that I have.
Yeah, well, but how about all the special ed kids who are costing us a bundle?
Well, I think it's a much bigger issue than that. I think we need to look at the overall education funding formula. What do you think?
Well, this is a federal mandate, and there's the state, and it's made worse with all the speaking of mandates, and what are you going to do about them?
Well, right now I have to go to a planning and development committee meeting because we're at our JF deadline. So maybe we can talk more later.
So folks, I've been frustrated just by saying those words. A number of different things happened here. I didn't give Patrice any specific data. We weren't on the same page in terms of what we were talking about. I talked about special ed, then I got into mandates. She said, oh, it's such a bigger issue. We gave you some legislative lingo. We talked about, she had a P&D meeting and they were going to JF some bills. P&D meaning the Planning and Development Committee, JF meaning, as we said to you earlier, it's a meeting to vote on some bills out of committee. I didn't establish any real priorities. I didn't say, I have 3 priorities I'd like to talk to you about. And then there was no direct ask. I didn't ask for, more money per pupil. I didn't ask for a better review of IEPs. I didn't ask for, what are you going to do to help us change the reading program? Don't you realize timing wise, we, are adopting our budgets at this time. And then at no point in the end did I say, I'd like you to give me an answer, or may I follow up with you in 2 days or 2 weeks? And by that time, I will have given you some more information. So there are a number of ways in which you can help make that conversation go better. So we have one more way in which we would start using that. So I would say, thank you for joining me today here, Representative Patrice. I know you have many priorities.
I do, but I'm very interested in the education issues, and I really appreciate hearing from school board members. I it's important that I understand how what we're doing at the state level is going to impact our district. So let's talk about your priorities and how they fit into what I've been hearing from other education organizations.
So acknowledging that there are other people in the room, that's great. So we appreciate the partnership with the state. Our students are making great progress, even as we have had to look at our budget in preparation for the next fiscal year and review our programming to see if it's all being implemented with accountability. I want to let you know how implementing our special ed program is working for my district. We have seen X more students identified. We have seen Y more opportunities for outplacements. Again, you can't always say those numbers by virtue of privacy, but the outplacements are costing us Z times more. You know, that is something you can talk about. We have implemented ABC program at the elementary level to potentially decrease the number of students who are identified. We have also reviewed our curriculum of our EL students to ensure that they are not being overly identified. We have looked at our budget and we have seen an increase in the costs over what was budgeted by X dollars. And this is a percentage of an increase, and we can't sustain that.
Well, I've actually heard the same thing from my own Board of Education and superintendent. I'm concerned about the trend in outplacements. There seems to be an area that we need to look into more. And I wonder if you think it's based on better identification of student needs, or if we're seeing students with more severe challenges.
Great. So I would say at that point, we find it's a bit of both. And let me tell you, the special education director, let me ask them to gather some more information and some numbers and some narratives so we can better understand the issue. It will help you as you lobby your fellow legislators to consider the importance of making a change on the issue.
I really appreciate that. And the more data I have, the more effective we can be working together and hopefully make some changes during this legislative session. And I really appreciate your willingness to look into this and to get back to me.
Wonderful. Great. So folks, that's, I mean, we are play acting here. We know that your meetings don't necessarily go as bad as the first one. But if we pointed out on anything, it's the ability to help with information. It's the ability to say, oh, you know, you as a legislator or maybe a state senator, let's say, they don't represent just your district. They represent districts, you know, some of them represent tens of districts. So, you know, you might want to talk to the district next door and say, we want to get our senator the most up-to-date information and have a real growing concern. Let them know that there is a growing concern. What's your district doing on this program? And there's strength in numbers is what I'm getting at. So I guess with that, I'm happy to take questions. And if you're new to the whole process, if you've got other questions, if you're not new to the process and you'd like to be more involved with what CABE does, that's great too. Well, why don't I pause and just see if you've got questions?
We don't have any questions at this time, but we'll give folks some time.
Okay. I do know that the CAPE is also involved in working very closely with the State Department of Education. Their legislative proposals will come before the state board tomorrow. Those are on the State Board of Education's website, and I can actually take you to a few different places right now that I think of it. Let me do that. So this is the CGA website, the Connecticut General Assembly's website. And typically what we're looking at is right up here, you'll see committees. If you click on committees and go down to education.
Sheila?
Yep.
So we do have exactly a question related to the CGA website. So I figured I'll read it first. That way you can.
Wonderful.
Okay, so our first question is, looking at the CGA website, It's extremely overwhelming. How do we best know what bills are new, where they are, and is there an easier website to look at?
There's nothing easier, but we can help you work through that. If you let me back up. I'll come back to the main page. So it's cga.ct.gov, number one. Number two, as bills come forward, there are in a what they call list of bills every day. So there would be and it's not up now because they're not in session, but it would say Senate list of bills, House list of bills, and you would click on it, and those are the proposed bills. There's not going to be a list of Senate and House bills all session long. These are proposed bills. At some point, there's a deadline. They can't continue to propose bills all session long. So from that list of Senate and House bills, which would be here, or maybe am I wrong now? Sorry, folks. Yes, here it is, list of bills. But those, let's see if this is yeah, okay, so here is last February's list of bills. I was wrong on where to find it. So these are all the bills that came forward that day. There were 7 pages of bills. It gives you the title of the bill, the number of the bill, the title of the bill. Obviously, there's a hyperlink so you can go right to the page for the bill. But then this is an explanation of the bill, which is always nice to have. It could be that long, which looks to be a good sentence, or it could be this third one. It just is very small. Provide additional resources and assistance for students with behavioral needs. But yeah, so if you clicked on this one here, you clicked on this one here. Well, you ought to be able to click on this one here. Well, let's just say, oh, there we go. Just took a little bit of time. So this is what the bill looks like, bill page looks like. Again, you have the number and the title and the explanation again. And here is the actual proposed bill. And there it is. It's only one page. The statement of purpose is essentially the same length as the bill. If I took you to, there's another way of finding bills. You go down here. If you knew the bill number, you could put it in right here. So Senate Bill 1 last year was, Senate Bill 1 every year is a priority for the Senate. So here's Senate Bill 1. As you imagine, it was more, there's more information there because it was a bill that moved forward. Just exit here. So here's the proposed bill on the bottom, moved forward in the committee process, got voted out with substitute language, went to the Appropriations Committee because it involved finance or funding. And then what's nice about the legislative process is once it moves forward to through the committee process, you'll see the full bill here, which at that point was 70 pages. If you move all the way down, when it becomes a file, and you'll see the file number there, you always can refer to the bill number, but there's a file number at the, yep, just about here. Nope, just a little earlier. Included in the file copy, yeah, here we go. So here's the end of the bill. It tells you section by section whether the section's new or a change to an existing piece of statute. And then it goes into a fiscal analysis. And this is where the Office of Fiscal Analysis, which is a branch of the legislature, there's a fiscal staff, there's a legal staff that write the legislation, and there's a research staff that that also looks at the implementation of a piece of legislation. The Office of Fiscal Analysis pleads with us to get examples of ways in which legislation would be impacted at the local level. And what do? We go to you to ask for help. To give them the most accurate information so that they can act or not act on a piece of legislation. So it moves forward to talk about, this is the funding process of the bill. And this is the OLR, which is the Office of Legislative Research. This is the research end of the bill in terms of they section by section. I like to say it's the English language of the bill versus the legal language of the bill. So they're explaining even detail by detail on all this piece of legislation. As bills move forward, and there's an amendment, the amendments can have fiscal impact, and those fiscal notes on an amendment are offered here. If you look down, there's bill analysis as well, and that's on the bill analysis, which is the research analysis on the bill. In the end result, this bill moved forward in the committee in the entire process and was voted out, became a public act signed by the governor, what have you. And here is the, again, English language of the bill. This is just, as I say, a summary of the bill, and it's 21 pages long, and that's always been helpful to everybody to be able to look at a piece of legislation that way.
Sheila, talk about how advocacy highlights can help people narrow down what they're looking for so it's not so overwhelming. I will say that once you start to use the Connecticut General Assembly website, it's like anything else. It becomes easier to navigate, and you become familiar with how to find things. But talk about the role of advocacy highlights.
Okay, so we let you know when there are committee meetings. And I'll just show you ways in which, oops. The Education Committee has got its own website. You found it there under committee. And they tell you when they have committee meetings. They're listed here. We tell you as well. Here's an agenda section. And here's the very first meeting this year. And again, the very first meeting is concepts. They don't have any bill numbers because they read all the pieces of legislation that come before the committee, and they say, oh, there's 7 bills on social emotional learning. We're going to kind of merge those all into one. So they approve concepts that go forward. And they, at this particular meeting, had 26 different concepts go forward. And then they decided to take Senate Bill 1 in its entirety and move that bill forward and draft it for a public hearing. So all these bills would be drafted and go to public hearing. Let me move back to, and again, there was another committee meeting, and that was to bills for review, which is JF. So these bills, this was the chef settlement that moved out of the legislative process rather quickly last year. So those were available for JF at that meeting. When we send out advocacy highlights, we tell you what bills are coming before them. We give you a synopsis of those bills. And then you know what day and time they're meeting. You have an opportunity to contact your legislator, ask them, I don't see a whole lot of information about this bill. It's really only a paragraph or so. What's the intent of that bill? Or could this bill help solve X problem in our district? Again, always helpful to have as much information to be able to advocate. If you let us know, we can be helpful to you as well. There's nothing like tag teaming. So if I know you've talked with your legislator and I see them in the hallway and I can say, oh, Representative Smith, I know you just talked to board member Yates. Do you really think, we'd like to see that proposal move forward. What more information might you need? Have you heard from other members? Have you heard from other board chairs? What can we do? Because then too, senators and representatives need to lobby their fellow legislators to move that concept forward and to gauge whether or not it's a problem statewide. So that's where having a statewide association is beneficial.
Sheila?
And then, yes.
So we have 2 more questions here. The next one being, is there a deadline that we need to keep in mind as far as talking to our legislators about getting on the list of proposed bills?
Yeah, there will be. The legislature as a whole adopts rules at the very first day of session. Session begins this year on January 4th. Typically, the rule debate is not usually fraught. It's usually agreed upon in advance in terms of the deadlines of things. It's about, let's see, it's a long session. Begins in January, ends in June. And the shorter session is 5 months, but this year's I'm sorry, 3 months. This year is 5 months. They will begin January 4th. It's about 2 weeks in that they end submission of proposed bills. I don't have the deadline because they haven't agreed to the rules yet. And then after that, the committees have deadlines to draft committee bills and then get those bills forward to the committees for public hearing and so forth. Every committee also has its deadlines. They must vote any bill that they want to out by a JF deadline. Typically in the Education Committee in a long session year, it's the first or second week of April, as I recall. If the deadline stated in the rules is a Friday, or let's say it's a Monday, the members of the Education Committee like to finish their work the Friday before in case there's any problem that they would have to go as far forward as the following Monday. The committees that have the longest deadlines or the most time to get their work done are the bigger committees of Appropriation, Judiciary, Finance. But again, education's one of the longer ones too, but its deadline would be before those. Because then they would want to send their bills to those committees. And there is a budget debate in the Appropriations Committee, and there is a debate in the Finance Committee on revenue estimates as well. Typically, the Finance Committee does not have a deadline before April 15th, and even a few days after that, because then they have some sense of the revenues in a very preliminary way that have come into the state of Connecticut by April 15th.
Was there another question, Will Marie?
There is. So the next question is, for the upcoming session, what do you see are the hot button issues, those issues that we as Board of Ed members should be concerned with?
Wonderful question. So there are issues on special education in terms of the funding. Senator Looney put forward a bill that tiered funding for, he included more funding, or he proposed more funding, but he also did it in a tiered capacity. Right now, the special education excess cost grant is a reimbursable grant. It will continue to be a reimbursable grant. And those funds depend, how much money comes to your district is depending on how many students you seek reimbursement for. So the legislature says they have X in the pot, or the department has X in the pot. And then, so therefore there's a percentage of money that comes back down to the districts. It's been about 72%-ish about there for a number of years. In adding the funding last year it increased it to about 90% for districts to be reimbursed back. They had that much money that you could have gotten 90% back of your costs. But the tiered process that he also set up, or the legislature as a whole set up, only went to tiers of 70, to a top tier of 76%. So from 76 to 90, there was no mechanism to have that money be distributed. There was no formula to have that money be distributed. So that will be fixed in the next legislative session, because, in fact, we hope it'll be fixed early in the legislative session. Cue for maybe a really big role you could have in advocating by February, before February, because that would be the first time those monies would be dispersed back to your districts in terms of the disbursement schedule that the department makes. That's but one issue. We expect we'll see some legislation potentially on the reading program. There may be legislation on social emotional learning. I don't necessarily know what might come forward on that, but we always expect that because that was a big piece of legislation last year. There are issues on school buses in terms of electric school buses. And there has been a, probably 5 months ago, there was a fire on a municipal electric bus. And there is a program to initiate electric buses in the state of Connecticut. There are 2 electric school buses in the state of Connecticut. ACES has one, and I don't know what the other district is. But you know, we expect there'll be more money for that. We don't know how many districts have sought money to establish charging stations to begin with. It's a huge expense, but we expect more conversations on electric school buses. Those are the ones that come to mind the most at the moment. From the State Department of Education, their proposals that are on their website, and I can lead you to that as well. Their proposals involve chef cleanup language. They involve, I took a note here, chef cleanup legislation, alliance districts, in terms of there are 3 new alliance districts that have been added, but the funding mechanism for those districts isn't appropriate, so they're going to be looked at as a base funding for 2012 versus 2021, and that's the change. There is legislation on magnet schools, cleaning up of that legislation because those are now part of the ECS formula as a whole. There's some money. There's some legislation proposed for the military compact. So the students that are in the military, that are military students, typically down in Groton, the way in which they move in and out of public school settings, and that compact was established, I would say 10 or 15 years ago. So they need to make some changes there. Those are the ones that come to mind, but I believe there are 8 different proposals. Let me get you into that.
While Sheila's doing that, Will Murray, are there any additional questions?
There are none at this time.
Okay.
So if I went to the State Board of Ed's website, which would have been more easily done, right on their main page, there is a, you can hit on the State Board of Education. So there's an easier way to get in than I just did. Their meetings and agendas, 2022. Here's the agenda for tomorrow. And here are their legislative proposals. This format is the way in which they submitted to the Office of Policy and Management. So it's a little cumbersome, but there are 8 different proposals in there. And here's the first one on alliance districts that I mentioned. These proposals will go to there is a committee on legislation and policy that will meet tomorrow morning at the State Department of Education at 8:30. They will, their agenda is here. I'm sorry, their agenda is here. And it's review of No, I guess they're coming straight to the committee as a whole, so there won't be discussed in the beginning of the meeting here. We're a little surprised by that, but that's the way they're going to do it tomorrow. The agenda for the full board is here. This board meets the first Wednesday of every month at the State Department of Education, which is on Columbus Boulevard in Hartford. There's the approval there for their legislative proposals on their agenda. And that's what the agenda looks like. This is I'm going to say a lighter agenda than usual, although they're not that
It doesn't mean the meeting will be shorter.
Does not mean we, could be any number of people offering public comment before the meeting starts. There is some changes to math education, as you'll see down here on 11. And that proposal did come before their subcommittee, I think back in October. We can get you copies of that as it comes forward, or there may actually be a proposal in here. Let's see. Yes, here it is. So here's changes that they're suggesting for math education, which is interesting because they're also working on reading as well. As I recall from the conversation or the discussion in October, it was to help, I use the word demystify, but that's not the word I use. I want to use. It's in terms of saying, oh, I don't want to take statistics. If statistics was a part of 9th grade math, you wouldn't be taking statistics. You would be taking 9th grade math. Statistics would be a component of that coursework. So there's ways in which, again, we follow both the department and the legislature. And even this morning, maybe a number of you were still on these calls at 8 a.m. every couple of weeks with the State Department of Public Health and the State Department of Education on the public health needs of every district. Today's discussion largely was centered on your test kits. Your COVID test kits are set. Most of them are set to expire by the end of January, and certainly want to get those test kits out to as many people because there's a cost associated with disposing of those test kits. And also you want to make sure that the many people have them that need them. And then there is potentially the ways in which school districts can still assist in getting test kits. Did you want to offer any more on that meeting at all?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. All right. We are just over a minute over, or well, actually, no, we said we were going to 1:15. So if you've got other questions, I'm happy to help you. Hope you know how to reach us. You can call the office. You can email us. We are just beginning, as I said, to set up breakfasts the CAVE as a whole has members on our board that help get information out to each of you. This morning we had a meeting on diversity. So we've got different ways in which we're assisting districts. Maybe I'll just do a pause here. All right, I think we want to thank you for your time. And again, you know where to find us, and we are happy to help you lobby because it makes our association stronger on behalf of you. Thank you.
Have a good day.